Hello, Bill.
Hello, Matt.
Good to talk to you. And interesting week in politics. How are things in northern DMZ?
Exhausting. You clear the potty training hurdle with one child, and then you have a sleep regression with the other child. So.
The life of a family man. I feel your pain. I know what it's like.
Well, you're new with having two.
Yes.
So you're not quite ready for the world of never getting a break.
Well, yeah, I will say that the thing that is obvious is that 1 + 1 = 3, in the sense that I would say that having two isn't just twice as hard. It's a kind of a multiplier effect, because you're dealing with many different variables, and that how one child impacts the other child. So, but it is ultimately fun, and the cliche is true, Bill. The obvious cliche, the toughest thing you ever do, but also the most rewarding. I think that's true. So we're getting by, but you know who's not getting by is RG3. I know that
I'm not in D.C. I'm in Patriots country.
Yes. Well, it must be a charmed life to be a Patriots in Patriots country.
I'm not a Patriots fan. As you know, Matt, I'm an Aussie rules man. I'm not even an NFL man.
Well,
I am a complete. I'm a complete liberal stereotype. You know, I am part of the tiniest minority of America, the white male Obama voter who does not watch football on Sundays.
Well, no, really though, Bill, we talked around Christmas time about how you go out into the woods and chop down a tree and shoot it. So you are in some way, you're not stereotypical. And in terms of sports, this is one area where I am maybe more stereotypical conservative, and you are more stereotypical, effete, liberal, Northeasterner.
Right, so and it wasn't always like that. I used to be a bigger sports fan. I just sort of felt myself, I didn't leave sports. Sports left me is how I kind of feel about it. But I have kept an eye on RG3. I do like the idea of the flashy rookie taking the team from rags to riches. I was a little sad that he didn't get to go farther in the playoffs. If I have to suffer the Super Bowl in a few weeks, I might as well have it be an entertaining, game.
Right.
Less chance of that now.
And RG3 was fun to watch, no doubt about that. It was entertaining, absolutely.
And I am interested in the question of, how far is it appropriate to push these athletes? And this whole issue sort of hits home with me because as a kid playing sports, I always had friction with the win at all costs attitude. I was always an odd duck. I played football and I played basketball and I played baseball, and I always chafed at the attitude of the coaches of the team, pushing us to the brink all the time. And I was like, Jesus, this is high school for Pete's sake. And none of us are going to become stars. Can't we just go out and have some exercise and have some fun and be done with it? And why you would ever risk permanent injury for anything for a game as a kid is totally beyond me.
Right. Well, it is going to be interesting. We were just talking about the parent thing. I mean, as a dad, the first thing I would do if I was commissioner of Little League Baseball would be to ban parents because they're absolutely horrible. But you're right. I mean, like as a kid, it seems silly to risk injury as a kid. But RG3, number one, is making millions of dollars as an athlete, and number two, this is the playoffs, Bill. We assume that the Redskins got this great young team and that they're going to be back here. We don't know that. This might have been his only chance, and so there is. He's not a kid. I mean, I do understand where you're going with that.
He's 22, right?
Well, but he's not.
It's his rookie year. He should have a 10, 15 year career. I mean, this is the friction. Obviously the culture of professional sports is seize the moment. You never get another chance. This is how the great ones are made. When Michael Jordan limping on a broken leg and
Kurt Schilling with the bloody sock.
Right, These are things that are glorified, but a hard-headed coach and a hard-headed owner should be saying, this is our potential franchise for 15 years. And why should we run this kid into the ground now on when he could be a star forever and have a much happier life? Let's have some faith that this guy has enough talent that we'll get another crack at this.
Well, and there's an argument for that, and that's essentially the decision that the Washington Nationals made this year, and a lot of people, including yours truly, criticized them. They had Steven Strasburg, who was coming off of Tommy John surgery. They decided to bench him like in September, right before they went into the playoffs, and of course the Nationals lost. They didn't, and the assumption is the Nationals are a young team. Strasburg's going to have a great career. They'll be back in the playoffs every year. But I got to tell you, Bill, when I was a kid, when I was like 9 years old, the Baltimore Orioles, my team, won the World Series, and I assumed that they would be back every year, and I'm still waiting on that. There are people like Don Mattingly, who played his entire career for the New York Yankees. Okay, the winningest franchise in sports history. Never made it. Never in his entire career. Never made it to a World Series. So if you have a chance, if you get to the playoffs, there is an argument to leave everything on the field. But Bill, I think that the dichotomy that I wrote about at the Daily Caller is this difference that you alluded to, the culture of sports versus the journalism culture. And I think that this is an interesting topic that it sort of transcends sports even. It goes to like America. What are we, a gritty warrior culture, or are we sort of this don't get hurt, sort of culture? And I think that we're losing some of our macho-ness. Mark Maskey from the Washington Post told Tony Kornheiser that he interviewed players in the locker room after RG3 went down, and that they were unanimous, that you could not take him out of the game. You simply could not. So the way that players view this is different than the way you and I view it, because we're normal people and they're sort of like warriors.
Well, it's been pumped into the brains of every young child who plays sports, and that only gets more so when you're playing at the college level than at the professional level. That essentially you're not a man unless you're going out there and how would you ever win it all? The great ones, the winners, are the ones who do it when they're the buyers are the most broken. This proves you're a champion,
right?
Right.
But Bill, I think this is bigger than sports, and you're right about the culture of sports. But this speaks to something American. That, the rugged life, as Theodore Roosevelt, who, by the way, saved football. There's a book about that, how TR saved football. So there's something about, being a young 18-year-old guy who wants to join the Marines, who wants to fight, who wants to play football and suck it up when there's injury. And you could argue that that's unhealthy. I sure as hell don't want my sons getting injured playing football. Especially for a meaningless high school game or something. But on the other hand, isn't there a larger at the macro level? Doesn't a society need young men who want to fight and do crazy things? Don't we need them on that wall? Don't we want them on that wall? We need them on that wall.
But they also need adult supervision. I mean, and I think this is not just a sports conversation. This is a politics conversation too. What the balance between how much you risk in the moment, and how much do you plan for the future? This is very much like Obama and the fiscal cliff. That folks on the left say you should have totally gone over the cliff. How dare you flinch at the end and only get half of your tax cuts for the wealthy? You could really stuck it to the Republicans, and you would have had this glorious moment, but. Obama said, "I'm gonna take my 3/4 of a loaf now," to quote Michael Grunwald at the time, who had a piece today telling liberals to suck it up and accept what Obama could accomplish, and to take what he could get and maintain political capital to get the next deal.
Well, this is This is actually a good analogy, Bill, because. RG3 wasn't doing his team any favors at some point. I mean, he got them off to a great 14-0 start in that playoff game against the Seahawks, the hated Seahawks. He got them off. The Redskins were really rolling there, But at some point, it became clear that he was very injured and that he couldn't. It was affecting his passing. Even he could not. It wasn't just that he couldn't run, but it had all sorts of implications. And you could definitely argue that the Redskins would have been better served strategically. Never mind the sort of macho aspect, but just strategically, it would have been smarter to have a strategic retreat and put in Kirk Cousins, the backup quarterback, who, by the way, won 2 tough games that got them into the playoffs the last time RG3 was injured. So it's not a weird analogy that you're making there.
But our culture in general, celebrates dramatic confrontation, celebrates dramatic sports moments. It doesn't celebrate hard work and practice. It doesn't celebrate, hard-fought, protracted negotiations. It doesn't celebrate unsatisfying compromises.
The Lincoln movie was a mixed bag.
They're the damnedest.
It was a mixed bag, but right. But that's maybe as close as it gets. I do want to say this, Bill. I think the point that I mainly want to make that I don't think I've made yet is the dichotomy between how people who are professional athletes and coaches, their worldview, versus journalists and observers. Because I was on Twitter when this happened, when RG3 injured his knee again, and it was unanimous amongst the people the journalists in sports and political journalists that I follow on Twitter. They were unanimous that it was irresponsible to have him in the game, that Shanahan should have pulled him sooner. And yet, Coach Mike Shanahan, who has a lot on the line, decided to keep him in. RG3 ostensibly wanted to stay in, and all the players felt he should have stayed in. At least that's what they told Mark Maskey. And I don't think that this was sort of posturing. I believe that they actually felt that way. That's my inclination, at least. So I do think it is interesting that the worldviews are different, for what that's worth. And I thought that was kind of notable.
Well, and all these decisions, whether it's the political level or the sports level, you're making an on-the-spot decision with incomplete data. You don't know what shape RG3's knee is in at that moment,
right?
For sure. Obama doesn't know exactly what the political dynamic is going to be 3 months from now, nor do the Republicans. Everyone has their theories who will have more leverage after this deal, but you don't know. You don't know what political events will happen within those 3 months that might upend your presumptions. You have to make spot decisions based on incomplete data all the time, and it's not being a wussy to make a decision with incomplete data. It says let's make a decision that I hope will lead to a better outcome in the future, even if I don't get the immediate glory. Now, maybe it's the wrong decision, and since you can't test run both choices, you'll never know. Maybe RG3's knee is shot to hell and never can play again. Maybe the surgery will work out and it'll be fine. You don't know.
Well, that's a good point,
Bill.
You're not
a jerk for thinking about the long game.
As we tape this, RG3 is having apparently one of what could be multiple surgeries, and I think that if RG3 starts, in August or September or whenever of 2013, then Shanahan and RG3's reputation ultimately will be vindicated, and they'll be seen as kind of tough guys and gamers. But if RG3 doesn't start that first game, and if this becomes a nagging injury, then I think everyone will view him as an idiot and as a jerk, and it was obviously the wrong decision. So my point is that journalists are hypocritical as much as anyone else, and fans are too. I mean, if Kurt Schilling goes out there with the bloody sock, or Brett Favre goes out there after having surgery, or Michael Jordan or whomever, if they do well and nothing bad happens, then we praise them. And it's also journalists too. It's not just the public. And if something bad happens, we criticize them.
Well, speaking of challenges of journalism, we lost a great one this week with Richard Ben Cramer's passing, the author of the belatedly lauded "What It Takes," and I don't know if everyone listening in the DMZ is aware of the cult of what it takes in Washington journalism quarters, but it was a huge tome of the 1988 campaign that wasn't released until 1992. We spent years on it. It was before the age of these of Insta campaign books, where they published the book in the middle of the campaign. He wasn't a political journalist by training. He wasn't a beat reporter. He wasn't a cable talking head. He just immersed himself in the lives of several of the 88 candidates to try to answer the question, what does it take? What kind of a person wants this job and motivates them to push everything aside and go for it? And essentially like 7 biographies all overlapping with each other. And so I had, you have read it too, man, is that correct?
Yeah, I read it around 1999. It is a tome. It's a very long and very good book. So it's been several years, but I did read it, and I'll tell you what I remember about it. A couple things. One, the horrible tragedy that happened to Joe Biden, where his wife and I think some of his kids were in this horrible car accident, and the book very poignantly tells that story. Also, Bob Dole. I had no idea that his injuries were so extensive, and the book is his war injuries. The book really tells that story in a compelling way, and frankly, I don't think most of the American public knew about Dole. I think that he didn't talk, and maybe foolishly, in terms of political.
Or Biden's backstory, for that matter.
Right. These are guys who, I would say especially Dole, but both of them have these amazingly tragic stories that don't get talked, that a lot of people don't know about. I'll say that.
Right. I mean, at the time, Dole was sort of dismissed as this angry grouch. He after he lost the New Hampshire primary to Bush, he famously said to his I think it was to Bush's face. I think it was said by Saigo, if I remember correctly. At least was on live TV with NBC. He said, "What do you have to say to George Bush?" He said, "Stop lying about my record."
Right.
That sort of seemed to cap, the ungracious loser. And Biden, of course, got drummed out of the race because he got knocked with a plagiarism charge, which was it does seem to be trumped up and inadvertent and not. But he was accused of having a pattern of behavior because there were some incidents in college too. But they both had these dramatic obstacles to overcome, and of course today they're both totally lauded for being great statesmen. They've risen above what knocks they took back in '88, and it takes someone who is interested in the longer view to draw out those stories. Is not have his feet cemented in the 24/7 gotcha news cycle, and some folks that say that Cramer launched the era of reporting of to try to divine the inner being of all these candidates, but everyone did it in just a far more slapdash, superficial way, and have run the whole genre into the ground, and we'll never get back to what Cramer was shooting for in the first place.
Well, and apparently, my understanding is what he did was he wanted to write a book about the campaign, and nobody would talk to him. So he started calling, like, Dick Gephardt's sister or mom, and he would show up, like, right, in Iowa, or show up, in Missouri or wherever they were from or wherever they were at, and, like, start interviewing and doing, he's spending literally years to do this and interviewing people that nobody else would think to interview. And really, and obviously the whole conceit, the whole premise is of what it takes is what does it take to be president, and he focused on both sides. I mean, he talks about I remember there's a lot about how Michael Dukakis' campaign manager actually leaked the Gary Hart stuff, I believe.
Right.
And Dukakis,
but he leaked the Joe Biden stuff.
The Biden stuff, and he had to fire.
That I mean, and this was, I mean, it's so bizarre because if it happened today, it would be a complete, it would be an anti-scandal. He would be praised for his devilish ways. But someone spliced a tape of a speech of Joe Biden's and a speech of Neil Kinnock's, who was a British Labour Party politician.
Right.
And they had some similar phrasing about their personal biographies. So it seemed a particularly damning act of plagiarism that Biden sort of stealing someone else's life story. And apparently he had, in other versions of the speech, Biden had given him credit, and just for whatever reason, the draft of this one speech, the other speechwriter left it out, and Biden didn't think to insert it. So John Sassow, who was Dukakis, who's sort of kind of his Karl Rove, his real right-hand man, the guy who arguably, forced Dukakis to run Dukakis, but didn't even have his heart in the whole thing. It was Sassow's vision. He splices the tape. He feeds it to the press. Sort of no fingerprints feeding, so no one knows where this tape comes from. And then it becomes a whodunit in the press. Which mean, nasty campaign dared to feed Opera research to the press? And Dukakis, not knowing Sasso did this, it says publicly, if someone on my campaign did this, they're fired.
Right.
And he finds out after the fact that it was like his closest aide. And he feels compelled to fire him. He actually fires him for a time. He then brings him back later in the campaign. That leads to a lot of internal campaign dysfunction because he was clashing with the person that replaced him. And so it really was one of the several reasons why the Dukakis campaign, blew a really good chance because he was leading in the polls for a good part of that race. In 2012, Sasso would be a star for digging up.
Well, they were trying to have the moral high ground. They didn't have the cult of toughness that we have now. The other thing, too, as I recall, the book talks about how a young George W. Bush doesn't trust Lee Atwater, George H.W. Bush's guru, and is assigned to basically tag along and keep an eye on him. So there's a lot. Now, the interesting thing is that that the book did not do that well initially. But
right.
Its legacy is that it has inspired a lot of the, I say young, not young, but youngish political journalists out there now. And, Chris Cillizza was on my podcast about 6 months ago talking about his new book. And we talked about how they took, Chris Cillizza and I think Jonathan Martin from Politico and a few others took a pilgrimage to, I think it was the Eastern Shore home of Richard Ben Cramer, which involved like going down dirt roads and really a trek, like right, like going to Mecca kind of thing, once in a lifetime journey to pay their to pay homage to the master. So he is even though I don't think a household name, a lot of the youngish political journalists today. The ones that you may argue are dumbing down and not doing the kind of reporting that he did, really were inspired to become, in many cases, political journalists by Richard Ben Cramer.
Well, and I do find that bizarre that there is this reverence for him in the current Washington political journalist community. They don't do anything like what he does, and there is no internal pressures in newsrooms to replicate what he does. No one thinks of let's do something that's really long form, that's not about winning the morning, that tries to actually get at some underlying truths and treat these politicians like three-dimensional human beings. Nobody does that. So.
Well, I take it as a positive sign that they revere him. But I mean, let's just be. It's like don't hate the player, hate the game thing, Bill. I mean, you couldn't do what he did today. You just, even if you had, what happens? People
couldn't do it to make a lot of money.
Well, people get involved in political journalism, and then they face the harsh realities of the business, and you got to do what you got to do sometimes, and you end up winning the morning, because that gets page views and ad impressions, and we all, to one degree or another. This is a business, and so I don't I don't necessarily hold it against them that they're not living up to the standards that he set. I mean, if he were young today and had to make a living in the business today, now he was a little bit different because he wrote about baseball and stuff. And I think he wrote some Rolling Stone magazine stuff. And I mean, he was. But if he had to make a living as a political journalist today, I suspect he would be like the rest of us, flesh and blood. Maybe a little bit a better writer, no doubt, than me, but still, he would probably be on Twitter.
Well, I mean, the problem is you need to have a business model where you can hope to move a lot of units of a long-form work after you spend the several years to produce it. I just was reading this New York Times piece about Bill O'Reilly's history books. He's sort of killing Lincoln and killing Kennedy. And he literally is cranking out these books, year after year. Right. He's using someone else does all the legwork, does all the research, that he puts the Bill O'Reilly narrative on it. And these books are not historically accurate. They won't even sell Killing Lincoln at the Ford's Theater because there's too many factual inaccuracies in it.
All right, let me just stop you there. I haven't read the book, but I've heard from some people that the inaccuracies are minor and that it's overwrought. For what it's worth, I just want to put that out there.
Fair enough. Okay. But he's certainly not America's premier historian.
Right. Well, that's Doris Kearns Goodwin, who has her own background as well. So.
Right. Fair enough. But he sells more copies of history books on an annual basis than your average actual professional historian does.
And you could argue that you could argue that's a good thing. That's a gateway drug to bigger and better things. You could argue.
Well, what hopes, or it just means Bill O'Reilly makes a lot of money and real historians don't?
That's the other option, or maybe it's a win-win. I don't know.
I'm actually in the middle of Edmund Morris's Theodore Roosevelt series, which is really just fantastic.
I know the first one won a Pulitzer Prize, man, but I got to tell you, it's a tough slog for me. I could not get through those books. It was a tough slog.
Any kind of real serious history book about a president has so many strands to dig into that they're all going to be slogs. They're going to take a lot of. I mean, he's literally spent decades on this thing, and I don't know how much money he made off of it. I think he obviously makes money off of other books that he does too. But I think he's done all right for himself. I don't think he's begging in the streets. But there's a sort of business model that gives you the leg room to do that, and some faith that it's going to pay off in the end.
Well, I would say my model, Bill, has always been. I got it from, I don't know if it was George Clooney or one of those guys who's an actor, and they said, one for you, one for me. So they'll do one hit movie that maybe they don't love to make money, and then they'll go do their little artistic vanity, project. And so it's like they'll do one for the mass. And that's kind of how I've tried to view my writing is you gotta do stuff that gets clicks, and then but then that affords you the opportunity to write like about the Armenian genocide or something that's a big important issue but no one cares about. But going back to the tough slog thing, Bill, it did occur to me. I was telling one of my young coworkers here at the Daily Caller, who was probably born as Richard Ben Cramer was writing What It Takes, that the reason I read the book, not the reason, but the reason I got through the book, What It Takes, because it is a tome, is because I used to do a lot of flying. And it used to be, if you flew, you didn't have anything else to do except for read. You couldn't, get on your laptop. Well, I guess you could, but you couldn't get on the internet. You didn't have the iPad. You didn't have, maybe you had a Walkman, I suppose. I don't know. But I found myself doing a ton of reading during air travel, and that is something I don't do anymore. I typically watch movies or something, for what it's worth.
Right. I first picked up What It Takes. I don't totally remember exactly the chronology of events in my head. I actually read it in college, and I'm a little older than you, so it was actually around the time it was published in the around 92, 93. And this is one of the first campaign books that I ever read, if not the first. I can't remember if it was that one or the Newsweek Quest for the Presidency 1988. They used to do the Quest for the Presidency every 4 years. And they used to have reporters in the campaign war rooms that with the pledge not to release anything until the campaign was over, so they'd get a lot of inside stuff. And this is, my first understanding there was sort of an extra layer of behind-the-scenes reporting that you get after the campaign. And I was fascinated by it. When I went to college, Oberlin, there's actually a program there where the students can teach classes called the Experimental College, and you get a credit for teaching. You have to draw up your curriculum. You have to get it approved. You don't get the same number of credits as you would for taking a class. So it's a little bit of an add-on, but it's a nice little program. And so I made up a class that I taught called Presidential Losers, and I assigned excerpts of What It Takes and From Quest to the Presidency and some other books. And I had a lot of focus on 88 and 92. I was focusing a lot on Dukakis and Gary Hart and Paul Tsongas. I got into Walter Mondale and Jimmy Carter because I thought that was the side of the coin. Everyone talks about what glorious things the winner did. No one really talks about what wrong things the other person did.
And by the way, Bill, there's a Michael Lewis book called Losers.
Yeah, well, it used to be called Trail Fever.
Yeah,
the hardcover was Trail Fever.
Yeah.
And the paperback was Losers, and that is a fantastic book.
Yeah, and it's sort of the same premise that you had about because look, I mean, one person wins, but there are a lot of people who do a lot of things right and do a lot of interesting things that sometimes don't get covered as much.
Right. So I got into it, to try to learn more about the other side of the coin, and I kind of miss those days when you get a campaign book that really was sort of the definitive explanation of the campaign. I feel like we're now in the game change world, which really isn't about trying to chronicle the campaign, but it's trying to come up with as many kind of you got
to make news. You got to.
How many scooplets can I come up with that are going to get into the Twitter stream chung?
I mean, trust me. I met with publishers or agents, not publishers, agents, about doing a look at this election, and the premise was where did conservatives go wrong? I mean, the assumption was Romney. The assumption was Romney lost, was going to lose. And how did we get here? And sort of a look back at from Herman Cain to Michelle Bachmann, everything that happened and why conservatives nominated him and where to go from here. But the whole point was, I had to get gossip and news. I mean, not just it had to be that was essentially what I was tasked with. And that's not me, or it didn't work out, or whatever. But let me say this, Bill. I know what you're talking about in terms of the books that you like. I'm going to recommend some books about campaigns that aren't that way per se, but I think that they're good books to read. If you like What It Takes, I'll give you just a couple that I think are really good. Bad Boy: The Life and Politics of Lee Atwater. Pick that up. There's one called Bare Knuckles and Back Rooms by Ed Rollins that's pretty good. It'll convince you to stay away from campaign politics, if nothing else. Chris Matthews' book, Hardball, is amazing.
Oh, that's great.
It is a must-read. And people who watch Hardball today, especially conservatives, have no idea what the book is. The book is amazing, and it's nothing like the TV show, even though it has the same name. It's about how to be successful in politics. But the other one that I will highly recommend is Buck Up, Suck Up, and Come Back When You Foul Up by James Carville and Paul Begala.
Worst title ever, though.
Not a great title, but if you just want campaign advice, how to do a campaign, it is super good. So, and we could go on and on. Stephanopoulos.
You're not Rules for Radicals, man?
You can. You can add rules to radicals. Saul Alinsky, you.
Well, I wonder one other thing before we wrap up, because you had some interesting blog post about has George Will changed? When you were having a fairly heady DMZ today, I thought I'd stay in this vein. You're raising this prospect that George Will's interpretation of conservatism is different now, has evolved over the past 20 years to something that was used to be more accepting of a degree of government involvement, and he's becoming more libertarian all of a sudden.
Right. It's not.
And I don't know if you have any kind of insight into why. He always has a position of himself as someone who's sort of unstinting. He is the pillar of real conservatism and is immovable regardless of what events swirl around him. So the notion that he's actually had a change is I think eyebrow raising.
Well, first of all, I want to make clear this isn't me. Others have noted this for years, apparently. I discovered that after the fact that this has been a topic of conversation for quite a while. But it came to my attention when Peter Wehner, who I believe was a Bush speechwriter, he wrote for a little while at Politics Daily, where I used to write it, and now he writes, I think it's a commentary where this is. And he wrote a really interesting piece, and it wasn't negative. It wasn't a gotcha piece, but it did show an evolution. And so, and I believe it was a 1983 book. George Will said, "A purpose of politics is to facilitate, as much as is prudent, the existence of worthy passions and the achievement of worthy aims." So he's basically saying that part of the role of politics and government is to help bring about the good. And Wehner contrasts that with what George Will now said recently in a speech, that government, thus limited, is not in the business of imposing its opinions about what happens or excellence the citizens should choose to pursue. Now, this all seems like highfalutin, whatever, but it is a pretty, if you dig into it, I mean, these are two different worldviews. I mean, both fit within the conservative umbrella, but one says that there is a good. I'll say it's more of a traditional Burkean conservative view. That there is a good, and that ordered liberty can use government to bring about something good, versus a more libertarian philosophy, which is essentially government should stay out of it. It's not government's business to decide what's good or right. But the cool thing that I liked about Wehner's piece is this wasn't a gotcha piece, like, you've changed, man. It was really a challenge to Will, and I think a sincere challenge to explain what happened. Over the course of our lives, Bill, things change. We get married, we suffer personal losses, we make money, we lose money, we have kids, there's tragedies. Things change, and that can change your entire worldview. The last thing...
Can I read...
Oh, please.
Okay, you have a last point?
Well, the last point I was going to make is that I didn't know, because I don't go around probing, but someone recently pointed out to me that George Will said that he's not a believer. He's not a person of faith. I think that was actually his word. Although he said something, although I'm not a person of faith, yada, yada, yada. But I think that is interesting, and there's no doubt that that could have an impact on. I don't know if that's something that's changed over time or not. I don't know. I'd love to know. I actually applaud Wehner, because I would love to read George Will's column about what happened to make him change his position on the proper role of government.
Now, I actually have always remembered a George Will column from 1992. Precisely because he had put distance between himself and libertarianism. This was in the summer of 92, and it was a column dedicated to mocking the Libertarian Party presidential candidate and lamenting that we no longer have serious third parties anymore. And this is what he wrote in 1992. The idea is that, quote, government power is opposed to individual liberty, unquote. Must we still debate such sophomoric notions? One's spirit sags at the prospect of plowing over all the overplowed intellectual ground from late-night college arguments. Long ago when we smoked French cigarettes and thought Italian movies were deep. But plow we must. So here we go. Police and armies that keep bad people at bay, and roads that make practical the freedom to travel, and education that makes people competent for life in a free society. These are not opposed to individual liberty. Besides, liberty, although very important, is not the only value. There's also justice, domestic tranquility, and a good 5-cent cigar. So,
amen, brother. Preach it. That's the George Will that I agree with. But let me just say this, Bill. It would be easy to point out, hypocrisy and flip-floppery. But I understand this because when you have to write stuff and provide content over the course of years and years, this will happen to you. But I think it would be cool to have him explain if this is the evolution. What has changed his mind? Clearly, something has. But
it does.
But things
does it
change.
seem like to you? Does it seem like to you that George Will wrote this in the last year of the Reagan-Bush era, before Bill Clinton got elected, and so I imagine the pulse of the time were a lot of a degree of grousing from the right that the Reagan-Bush era was not as conservative as they hoped it would end up being. This is after, of course, George Bush, accepted the tax increase and the like. And now it seems like now we're ending the first term of Obama, going into the second term. The recoiling that the right is having from this experience, I can certainly see it driving a less professional, more knee-jerk conservative into fringier territory and more simplistic arguments. You would think George Will wouldn't succumb to that, but perhaps it's just a human nature sort of thing where you're just reacting to the world around you, and how you feel compelled to put forth the more simplistic conservative arguments that are more libertarian nature and not get into the more refined, nuanced differences between the different strains.
Well, I think, and some of it too could be a matter of pragmatism. I mean, you could argue when Reagan's winning and conservatism seems to be winning, why change? Things are largely good, and then you could say, well, Republicans and conservatives overreached with Terry Schiavo and Iraq. And but that's at least that's at least explaining why you've changed, and I think that's the point here. I would love it, and George Will is, for better or worse, one of the preeminent conservative columnists. So that's why this matters. He is an opinion leader. I say him and Krautheimer, and I'm sure there are others that are. Cal Thomas is probably the biggest nationally syndicated, but you get my point. What he says matters. It has an impact, and so I think it would be interesting to know why he has changed his tune on some of these issues. And it very well could be that libertarianism is more in vogue today, certainly I think, than it was a few years ago.
Now, we talked last week about whether Glenn Beck was having more or less influence now that he's sort of an independent operator and certainly making more money. But does his distancing from having a traditional media platform, does that make him less influential in the discourse? And now he is doing a big launch for what I guess is a souped-up version of his TV network, and it has this huge libertarian flavor to it. And he said, I'm closer to Penn Jillette than Chuck Hagel, as a way to. And some people thought, perhaps, not that Beck wasn't libertarian before, but does he see where the wind is shifting within the youthful right? Where the next generation of the right is headed, and trying to be ahead of that curve by really emphasizing the libertarian aspect and picking someone like Penn Jillette as a model who is certainly not a social conservative by any means. He's a real, he's a libertarian as far as, drug, sex, and rock and roll are concerned, as well as other matters. And
Penn Jillette's an atheist and writes books and does stuff promoting it, whereas Glenn Beck is, a member of the LDS Church and is, at least was very pious is a bad word for it, but I feel like he was very much he very much felt that America was losing its culture, and that part of that was because God wasn't the sort of traditional religious values weren't around, and so it seems weird to me. He's been tight with Freedom Works, which could be a nice tie into the Dick Armey thing. I guess we have to talk about it now. He's been tight with Freedom Works for a long time, and so Beck does have a libertarian strand, but it strikes me as a bit odd. And yes, there's this BuzzFeed story about how Glenn Beck is going to rebrand the Blaze as a young libertarian site, and it strikes me as a little bit odd because I'm not saying that he doesn't or didn't have a libertarian streak. But it seems a little bit odd in light of his sort of cultural conservative, social conservative side that I don't think I'm inventing this. I feel like that's kind of was his brand for a long time.
Sure. Well, I mean, he's someone who is essentially probably a media personality, I think more so than an activist or intellectual leader. And I think he often shapeshifts with what is going to be good for his career. You know, he was doing, CNN headline news, a very different show than when he was on Fox. He wasn't nearly as conspiratorial when he was.
Are you sure? Are you sure about that? I remember him saying some controversial stuff on CNN headlines.
Oh, I'm not saying he was,
but he was also. The other thing I'll say about him is he used to have a talk radio, and maybe he still does. He had like a morning zoo, like a morning zoo kind of like talk radio, and it was actually really good. Like I liked it way better than his Fox show. He's actually funny. He really is funny, and he's smart. And I really liked his radio show. We didn't get it in D.C., but when I would drive up to see my mom in Pennsylvania, it was on up there, and it was actually quite delightful. And it wasn't just him. There was a whole cast of characters. He had his own, like, Robin Quivers and sort of stuff going. It was quite nice.
So he was one of the morning zoo pioneers. Salon had a great series about sort of the radio history of Glenn Beck and how he shifted from being sort of radio prankster to what he is today. And so, but he's always tweaking that, and maybe he's going to downplay his religious conservative side and play the libertarian conservative side because he sees a market for people, conservatives who are sick of the Republican Party, sick of the John Boehner, Mitch McConnell wing of the party, and wants a different place to play. That could be what his thinking is.
Maybe I don't know. The guy's very smart at business, and you cannot doubt that. Should I talk about Dick Armey while I mention Freedom Works?
Just do it quick, because your Daily Caller broke this story today. Because Dick Armey, he left Freedom Works. He was the face of Freedom Works for a long time. Freedom Works was one of the sort of the.
Well, okay, and here's the tie-in. I mean, the tie-in is that Glenn Beck does a lot of stuff for Freedom Works and has been very tied into Freedom Works, and it just so happens that Mother Jones and David Korn, who's a fine reporter, broke the story of how Dick Armey had left Freedom Works, and we don't have to recount that. But Dick, it was weird that Mother Jones sort of broke that story and actually broke a couple stories related to it. And then it turns out that Media Matters interviewed Dick Armey and got a lot more information. And Media
Matters, generally speaking, is not a journalistic outlet.
No.
They're a media watchdog group.
But they actually did like a pretty straight interview with him, and it was actually, as far as I can tell, well reported, and it was quite good. But it was odd, and a lot of people like Eric Erickson at Red State, my friend and a prominent conservative blogger, was upset and said, "Hey, if Dick Armey is going to go give an interview to Media Matters, why would he do that?" Especially after the Mother Jones stuff. And why don't you tell the rest, Bill? Because you read the story as much as I did.
So he talks all this smack about Freedom Works to Media Matters. He complains that they gave all this money to Glenn Beck, that they wasted their money giving Glenn Beck, I think, $1 million to plug Freedom Works all the time, and that didn't do anything as far as advancing actual ideas. It wasn't helping them, I guess, not reaching a wider audience because they were just preaching to the converted, I guess, was the complaint. And then Daily Caller, your group, caught and said, "What the hell, Dick Armey? Why are you talking to Media Matters?" And he's like, "Oh, I had no idea that was the liberal group. I thought it was the conservative watchdog group. What
Media Research
the guy
Center
with the red beard? What's that guy's name?"
Right. Oh, it's so good.
Brent Bozell from the Media Research Center.
And as I've joked, we're just damn lucky that he didn't think we were Daily Kos or the Daily Beast or something. I mean, that's so good.
Okay, so
and the funny part is that Media Matters actually wrote a good. I'm sorry. The funny part is that Media Matters actually wrote a good story about it. They actually reported it. It's pretty straight.
And Armey is not retracting what he said,
as far as I know.
I mean, if all Media Matters does is quote what he said, it some respect doesn't matter where he says it. He's still airing dirty laundry either way, although he's just making a liberal nemesis look good in the process.
And it'll piss off conservatives.
Right.
You know, the medium does matter. I said this about David Frum when I saw him on MSNBC, like as Stupak was selling out the conservatives, the pro-life cause over Obamacare. David Frum was on MSNBC talking about it, and I just think a lot of people hated him because he was on MSNBC, that network at that moment.
Right.
Right. So sometimes
you're in the dirty laundry of the other team.
Where you say it can matter. I mean, and look, I used to do and have done and will do again. I'm sure MSNBC and CNN and Fox, but it does. It is part. The medium is the message sometimes, and so if Armey had said that to a red state blogger, it would have been interpreted differently than if he said the media matters. So, anyway, what a funny case of mistaken identity.
But so, do you accept Dick Armey's explanation? Does that seem plausible that perhaps he's just a little doddering at this point and not really have his finger on the pulse of current Washington institutions and didn't know the difference?
Hell yeah,
or
absolutely.
Is this just a really lame excuse to cover up what he actually tried to do?
You wouldn't make that story up. You wouldn't make yourself look good by saying, no, I completely believe it. And I like Dick Armey. You can't help but like Dick Armey. He's funny.
You have some personal relationship with him.
I mean, I've talked to him. He's funny. He's affable. And he's the kind of guy who would mix up Media Matters and the Media Research Center. It's delightful. So
this is an in-character gap, as far as you can tell.
I think it's kind of charming. I mean, there now is this hashtag, by the way, which is poking fun at him, that's going around, and it's let me see if I can find it. Oh, it's pound Dick Armey is confused. So I don't know if this is going to be a small thing or if it's going to go viral, but there is that hashtag. So you wouldn't make that story up. If you make up stories, most people would rather double down and be like, he's damn right I talked to me, rather than say, oh, I got him confused. I think so.
It's like Al Roker pooping in his pants in the White House. Like, he did not make that story up.
Yeah,
he copped to that. It obviously happened.
And why would you cop? I mean, it's just a little bit too much Scher, too much information. A little bit TMI. We're very frank on this show, Bill, but I am not. Will not go there.
No TMI on the DMZ.
Not like that, my friend. Not like that. All right. My lights are out. My light, which is on a timer, just went out. So I think it's telling us it's time to go.
All right. Always good to talk to you, Matt.
You too, man. See ya.
Till next week.
On the DMZ.
Take care.